and others. In that period, do you recall whether you received advice from the then Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Professor Smith?
He was part of the process of giving advice, so during that period, the then Deputy Chief Medical Officer was mainly, I don't think this was exclusively, but mainly the Scottish Government's observer at SAGE, for example. So he would be the conduit of readouts, feedback from SAGE. They would come to me in written form, but he was frequently there in person around the table when I was discussing the matters with Dr Calderwood.
Thank you. And we've also obviously heard evidence from Professor Leach, who we've talked about already, the National Clinical Director. Was he providing advice as well at that time?
Undoubtedly he would have been, but it wasn't, as far as I recall, I don't think it would have been coming to me directly from Professor Leach, but I am sure he would have been part of the process of that advice being gathered from different clinicians and different experts to put to me.
The three principal government medical advisors, Dr Calderwood, Professor Smith and Professor Leach, came from an obstetrics and gynecological background, a general practice background and a dentistry background. Is that correct?
Yes.
None of them were trained in virology, epidemiology or respiratory medicine. Is that your understanding?
As far as I am aware, I know that they have varying degrees of experience in public health. Professor Leach in particular has qualifications in public health. Forgive me, I'm not saying this in any way to say these appointments are nothing, but the First Minister is not involved in the appointment of these, so that I wouldn't have been involved in the appointment process for any of these individuals. We've
seen in this module and others that advice was provided to the UK Government by Professor Chris Whitty, who is an expert in infectious diseases, public health, Sir Patrick Vallance, who had a background in clinical pharmacology and had worked in industry dealing with, amongst other things, vaccines. We've obviously seen and discussed some of the evidence that emerged from individuals in the background, certainly in Scotland, Professor Woolhouse in particular. Professor Woolhouse was also in his advice able to draw on discussions he had had with other experts, such as Neil Ferguson and others who he mentions. Did you have a concern over this period that the people from whom you were getting advice were not sufficiently expert to deal with the threat?
No, I didn't. The advice I got from all of these individuals, not just initially, but in the case of two of them over the course of the pandemic, I had a high degree of confidence and trust in, and I think that confidence and trust was justified. I was also aware that they were not simply giving advice to me as individuals, operating solely. They were drawing on other sources, Health Protection Scotland, other experts in various aspects of this. And of course, when we get into March 2020, the Scottish Government COVID-19 Advisory Committee is established, which has a range of experts. Professor Woolhouse, of course, was a member of that. And, I remember specifically the membership of that, again, was not selected by me. It was advised to me by Dr Calderwood at the time. And I do recall that she specifically said that she thought it was important to have him on there because she wanted to ensure that there was a diversity of views coming through that we didn't want to have people. Obviously, we were guarding against anything that could be described as groupthink or simply people that had one particular perspective.
But that body didn't exist. It wasn't set up until the end of March and became operational in early April. Is that right? Again, you will have the dates in front of me. I don't have the dates in front of me. I think it met for the first time in late March. And it was set up, established by Dr Calderwood at my request for specific reasons that I'm happy to cover if you wish me to. But before then, again, SAGE was an important source of advice. And although there were frustrations I had with the SAGE process that led me to ask Dr Calderwood to establish the advisory group, I had great confidence in the scientific advice coming through SAGE. So we
At no point did I feel that I was not getting good advice. It was an uncertain time. The knowledge of the virus was developing. There was significant doubts and uncertainties around different aspects of how it transmitted, which became less uncertain over time. But I had confidence in the advice I was getting, and I have great respect for and indeed real gratitude for the work that Dr Calderwood, Dr Smith and Professor Leach did in that period, and in the case of the latter two, subsequently to that.
We've seen some evidence to suggest that Dr Calderwood didn't appear to have very much of a plan as regards the testing aspect of the pandemic response. Was that your experience of dealing with her over this?
Forgive me, I didn't hear whether you said did or did not.
The evidence is that she did not have a plan
I wouldn't agree with that, and nor would it necessarily have been on testing solely for the Chief Medical Officer to have that plan. I think I said earlier on, we went from a period in late January to having no capacity whatsoever in Scotland to process COVID tests, to by the 10th of February, I think, if I'm getting that date correctly, to have facilities established in 2 labs, and in the week subsequent to that, capacity rolled out to every health board in Scotland. So there was a plan. I think there are very legitimate questions, which we covered this morning, about whether the pre-existing infrastructure we had in place allowed that plan to develop at sufficient pace. But I would contend the Chief Scientist for Health, David Crossman, was also closely involved in and brought great expertise to the role of developing our testing capacity and the use of testing, which of course was as important as the capacity that we had.
Would it be fair to say that Dr Calderwood was one of the main architects of what there was of a Scottish Government strategy in the period from January to March?
Strategy for testing or strategy for overall?
Overall.
She was a critical part of that. She was the main conduit of clinical advice to me, but that advice was coming from different sources, and she was part of the collective Scottish Government team that was responsible for both devising and implementing the plan to respond to the pandemic. I don't think it would be accurate to say that was her sole responsibility. And while different people would interpret phrases in different ways, key architect, I'm respectfully not sure would properly describe it either.
She resigned on the 5th of April.
Yes.
When did you become aware of the circumstances which led to her resignation? On
the evening of the 4th. The Saturday night. She resigned on the Sunday, if that's the 5th of April. Right. I struggle sometimes with the precise dates. On the Saturday evening, I got a call from one of my special advisors, who advised me that they had taken a call from a Sunday newspaper with the story that then emerged on that day.
Were attempts made within the Scottish Government to retain Dr Calderwood despite that report? So I will, as I do for all aspects of the COVID response, but in particular this one, I take absolute responsibility. In the immediate moment, and remember we're in the very early stages of an unprecedented situation, I had 2 considerations in my mind, and I'll end by saying what I think I got wrong in this. Firstly, I immediately understood that there would be significant public anger about this, and that would have to be addressed, and that Dr Calderwood would have to very clearly apologise and be very clear that she had made a mistake, and that the rules apply to her as they did to anybody else. The other consideration was that we were at this relatively early but still very pivotal stage in the pandemic, from a period of decision-making that was very fast-paced, that we had to respond very quickly to things. We had begun to settle into, I'm talking internally in government decision-making, more of a rhythm of how we were doing things, of the advice and the decisions that would then lead to. And Dr Calderwood was a very
key part of that. She was a conduit of clinical advice to me. I had high trust in her, and she was a key part of the communication effort as well. And therefore, I was mindful of how disruptive it would be to suddenly, in those circumstances, lose a chief medical officer. And so I initially thought I wanted to try to achieve two things: address the public anger and make sure there was no doubt at all that she had made a very serious error, but retain what I thought was very valuable expertise and advice in government. I think as the Sunday progressed, I began to realise I couldn't achieve both of those things, and that if I continued to try to achieve the latter of those, I would seriously compromise trust in the government's message, and that the internal ways of working, that was something for the government to deal with, and I had to prioritise the confidence in public messaging. So that led on the Sunday evening to me having a conversation with Dr Calderwood that led to her resigning. I should say, and I want to say this on the record, she had already reached that conclusion herself and made no attempt then to avoid her resignation. And I think it is to her credit that she, at that point, was very clear with me that the confidence in the public messaging had to take priority. And I do think perhaps stands contrast to other incidents, but I think that is to her credit. But it was a very difficult episode in what was overall an incredibly difficult period.
We've seen some correspondence over that weekend, as you described this. She eventually resigned late on the Sunday, the 5th, that tend to suggest that there was a process over that day whereby there was an evolving realisation, I think, that she would end up having to resign. Are you saying, for Ms Sturgeon, that your initial reaction was to try to keep her, but that became impossible?
Yeah, I think I thought wrongly, as it turned out, and I quickly realised this was not possible to achieve both of those objectives, to make sure we didn't have the public confidence in our messaging undermined and keep the Chief Medical Officer in post in the midst of a pandemic. And I perhaps tried to give equal weight to those considerations, but over the course of that Sunday I realised that was not possible, and if I continued to try to achieve the latter, the outcome of that would be the undermining of confidence, and that quickly led to the situation that unfolded on the Sunday evening. But as I say, Dr Calderwood had already, I think herself, come to that same conclusion. So
ultimately, did you tell her to resign, or did you agree that she should? In
point of fact, I said earlier on the Chief Medical Officer is not a first ministerial appointment. I probably technically couldn't have made her resign, but that wasn't necessary. By the time I spoke to her on the phone on the Sunday evening, I was clear it was an inevitable outcome, and she was clear it was an inevitable outcome. So the conversation really became that is what was going to happen.
We've also seen some internal correspondence involving Professor Smith and others that tended to suggest that the way in which the resignation had been handled had undermined their position, and they felt that it had undermined the confidence that they felt was in them to be able to continue in that role. Was that something of which you were aware?
I wasn't aware of it at the time. Looking back on it and having now seen that correspondence, I suppose that is not surprising. It was as I say, in the midst of a really tough, difficult time for everybody. This was an episode that, I hadn't known Dr Calderwood or worked with her for as long as others had. It was, it was upsetting, the whole circumstance. And so, yes, I can see that perhaps the process that unfolded over that Sunday of trying to achieve both of those things may have given an impression to other advisors that I thought the loss of her would be so catastrophic that they felt that I didn't value their advice or their input. That wasn't the case. I can perhaps see why they might have thought that, but that wasn't the case. I highly value the contribution of all of the individuals who were advising me.
Did that experience to any extent undermine the ongoing relationships of the team that remained in place with you?
It's certainly not in my experience, and I genuinely don't think that was the case. We very quickly, moved to an adapted way of working. Dr Smith became the, at that time, acting Chief Medical Officer, and later became Chief Medical Officer in his own right. And yes, there were difficulties over the next few days. We had to adapt to the loss of somebody who had been very central to our response going forward. But I don't think it damaged relationships at all. I think something else that I read into that correspondence was that there had been a sense of, because Dr Calderwood with me had been the key clinical communicator, had Dr Calderwood not resigned that weekend, we decided to try to establish a very firm point of contact between the public and the government. But that position of her doing the daily briefings with me every day would not have been sustainable, because it would have taken up too much of the time sheet. So we were already planning to move to a situation, which we did anyway, where the clinicians would share that responsibility.
I might, on that particular aspect of that correspondence, it might be read slightly differently, I think, to suggest that the remaining medical and clinical advisory team, if we can put it that way, were of the view that too much reliance had been placed on Dr Calderwood as an individual and not on the team more widely, and indeed other sources of expert advice. Was that, if that is the correct interpretation of that documentation, is that a fair representation of the way in which advice was taken from medical sources by the government?
I don't think so. I can absolutely see why that would be an interpretation that could be put on that, and it may indeed be what the author of that correspondence meant by it. Dr Calderwood was the principal conduit of advice to me. She was not the sole author of that advice. I said earlier on, I interacted regularly with Dr Smith in the period before Dr Calderwood resigned, so it wasn't as if he wasn't a key part of the response. He was, and a very valued part of the response. And you asked me earlier on about my experience as Health Secretary when we were confronted by swine flu, and I've had, albeit as Health Secretary at the time, although if swine flu had developed differently, no doubt the First Minister would have adopted this role, but I developed at that point a very key working relationship with the Chief Medical Officer, who at that time was Sir Harry Burns. And so again, that was part of the lesson I'd taken from that, the importance of that relationship, of having a clear conduit for advice was important. But of course, she wasn't giving me advice that she was the sole author of. She was drawing on multiple other sources in giving it to me.
But in translating, if you like, those sources of information to you, and her being the person that you're speaking to, there was a risk, was there not, that in that translation the right information might not be getting to you?
There was a risk. If I've given an impression, Dr Smith would not always be, but equally not infrequently be in the room at the same time. It wasn't that she was the only person that I was speaking to. Frequently in the very early days, she would take part, as Dr Smith did it later, in the calls between the 4 UK CMOs, and come straight off that call and give me information that she had got from the other 3 CMOs. So it was a situation where she may have been the principal conduit of information to me. She wasn't the only person in the room during these discussions, and I was absolutely aware that she was bringing to me information that came from different sources.
Her resignation was it not, Ms Sturgeon, a cataclysmic event for the ability of the Scottish Government to react appropriately to the threat, and also had an enormous effect on public confidence in the government strategy? On both of those, it had the potential to do both of those things. I don't believe it did either. Had Dr Calderwood not resigned on that Sunday evening, I believe, in terms of confidence in the public messaging, it may well have had that impact. I would suggest that the evidence through public attitudes and public polling after that suggests that it didn't have that effect. I think her resignation stemmed the potential for that. And on the first, it did have
a disruptive effect, but it was one that we were able to overcome reasonably quickly and establish ways of working. And, you know, I think I know Dr. Smith stepped up and did a very good job in those circumstances. So I absolutely accept the potential for both of those things to happen. I wouldn't necessarily agree that either of them were the outcome.
Thank you. Sorry to jump around a little in the timeline. I'm going to go a little bit earlier than that, beginning of April. On the 12th of February 2020, there was a ministerial tabletop exercise called Exercise Nimbus, which took place involving representatives of the UK Government, Scottish Government, Welsh Government and Northern Irish Executive. Was this something you were aware of at the time?
I undoubtedly would have been aware of it at a certain level at the time, but I don't think it was something at that point that was particularly high up my awareness scale, if I can put it that way.
You didn't attend it?
I didn't attend it, unless you're about to tell me that I did, and I haven't recalled, but I'm pretty certain I didn't attend it.
Ms Freeman also did not attend it. Mm-hmm. Is that your understanding?
Yes, that is my understanding. Yeah.
It was attended by Mr Fitzpatrick, who is a minister in the health area as well. Should either you or Ms Freeman have attended such an event, which was, we heard from Ms Freeman, an event which sought to update pandemic planning in order to apply more specifically to the circumstances of the emerging threat?
I think, forgive me, I haven't, in advance of today, reviewed Operation Nimbus. I hadn't been aware you wanted to question me on this, so I would have to go and review the detail of that to give you, and I'm happy to do so if you wish me to give you an answer about whether, with hindsight, on reflection, I think I should have been at it. Personally, I suspect my answer to that would probably be no. You know, having a minister, Mr Fitzpatrick, involved in that would not be in any sense abnormal in these circumstances, and you know, he would have fed back through the normal processes in government what the findings and conclusions and any recommendations from that would have been. There would have been, I'm absolutely certain, senior officials in attendance at it as well. I think
Dr Calderwood was at it as well, to be fair.
Dr Calderwood was at it. Then that makes part of my point. I think, and again, you know, we may come on to other aspects of this. I think in government, in normal times, but particularly in the times we were in, not everybody can be at everything. And just because a particular minister or a particular civil servant is not present at a particular meeting doesn't mean that that minister is not engaged in the outcome or the deliberations around that meeting.
But it's a matter of priority between conflicting commitments, one imagine.
Most days in government, yes, that is absolutely the case. That there will always be an element of prioritisation. Would
this event not have been, in the circumstances, given the evidence we've heard about the extent of the threat, something which should have been prioritised more than it appears to have been?
Possibly. I'm not genuinely not trying to avoid answering the question. I've not, in advance of this, reviewed Operation Nimbus, so I don't want to, without having done so, I don't want to be more definitive than I've been. It may well be that what you're putting to me I would answer yes to, and I'm happy to give some written evidence to the inquiry on this point, if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Ms Sturgeon. We have seen in a notebook from an individual named Mr Derek Grieve, the Deputy Director for Health Protection Division within the Directorate of Population Health, a number of entries ranging from the 26th of February to the 5th of March, which read as follows. On the 26th of February, it says that he attended the Cobra M meeting with the Cabinet Secretary, Ms Freeman. He noted that it's clear all departments in the UK government are fully engaged and mobilised in a way that the SG simply isn't. The next day, he indicates that despite attempts to encourage them, still no real engagement. They then spent 20 minutes talking about internal SG comms, completely amazed. And even by the 5th of March, he notes, I attended directors' meeting, laid it out thickly, but few believe this is going to be serious. Is that, as far as you're concerned, and as far as you were aware at the time from your position, an accurate understanding of the state of preparedness and urgency amongst directors in the Scottish Government, in particular the observation that it appeared that the UK Government's operation was sufficiently further advanced?
I couldn't comment in any detail on the UK Government's operation at that point, and perhaps I should limit myself to commenting on the government I was responsible for. That wouldn't be my understanding or experience. That said, and I didn't know about these views at the time, Derek Grieve is a civil servant that I have worked with in various capacities over my time in government. Again, he is a civil servant of the utmost professionalism, integrity and skill and expertise, so I would take seriously what he says. I would make two, I suppose, in acknowledging that I can't directly comment on a meeting I wasn't at and a note that I didn't write, beyond saying that was not my experience at the time. I think there's two other things I would say. In preparing for today, it struck me that at a cabinet on, I think, the 10th of March 2020, I make some quite extensive comments about the fact that this is going to be a whole government, whole society challenge and not just a health, I'm paraphrasing. So clearly at that point, it was something I was certainly stressing, that it had to be something everybody saw as their business and their priority. The other comment I would make, which possibly is not fair to ascribe, and I'm not trying to ascribe it to Derek Grieve, but I remember at the start of swine flu, as Health Secretary, that I sense when you're in a crisis that is very much initially focused on health, it is absolutely all you're thinking about. And even people who are thinking about it a lot, but maybe not as much as you, there is a sense of frustration that they're not as seized of it as you might be. And of course, swine flu, thankfully, didn't progress beyond it being largely a health challenge in the way that COVID did. My recollection, my experience, my understanding is that there was certainly an increasing over that period realisation of how serious this was in the Scottish Government, but there was a realisation that this was something that was serious and that was going to affect everybody and every section of our society.
Can we go to INQ 000238-705, please? These are the minutes of a Cabinet meeting held the day before the entries that I've started to read out from Mr Grieve's notes. On the 25th of February 2020, you're noted as being in attendance. Can we go to paragraph 44, please? It says, under any other business, novel coronavirus, the First Minister informed Cabinet that later that day she will be chairing a further ministerial meeting in the Scottish Government Resilience Room to discuss Scotland's response to the global outbreak of the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, about which there will be a fuller discussion at the following week's meeting of the Cabinet. It would be particularly important to ensure that messages to the general public were as informative as possible and couched in appropriate language. Was it appropriate, given the information we've looked at emerging from Professor Woolhouse in particular, that as at the 25th of February, novel coronavirus was being dealt with under any other business with no substantive discussion of what might be done to prevent its spread?
I think if that had been all that note was communicating, I would agree with you. But I was communicating the fact that later that day, I was chairing a meeting of the Scottish Government Resilience Room. That was, forgive me, what date?
The 25th of February.
I started chairing those meetings in 28th, 29th, I think, of January, with one exception. When I'd been visiting flooded areas elsewhere in the Deputy First Minister chaired, I chaired all of these meetings. This was a period where there was significant work ongoing. There was either the following week or the week after that at Cabinet, there was a very substantive paper submitted and led by Jean Freeman. So I would suggest that that was giving, if that had said there is there's a global outbreak of the novel coronavirus, we'll keep Cabinet informed, and there was no action behind it, I would accept that. But that, in Scottish Government terms, is very significant action that is clearly in train as a result of that information, and that there would then be a more fully informed Cabinet discussion in the week after that. This was also not the first discussion that Cabinet had had about COVID. I think the first discussion was on the 4th of February, and so there would have been extensive Cabinet discussions along the way, and that is an indication to fuller discussions that were ongoing across government.
There's no note of any discussion relating to procuring or building a testing capacity, is there?
Because that one note doesn't describe it, it doesn't. So this is the 25th of February. By the time this note is written, we have already taken the first steps to build testing capacity. Our testing capacity at the end of January, 0. By the 10th of February, two weeks before this note, we had established testing facilities in Glasgow and Edinburgh. I think we very quickly after that established a facility in Tayside in Dundee as well. I don't know whether that would have been before or slightly after this note. So clearly, evidently from the reality of what was happening, there was work to build up testing underway by the time this note was written.
There's no note of any discussion of the current state of building testing capacity, though, is there?
I would, but no, that note suggests there wasn't, but that doesn't mean that work wasn't underway. The Health Secretary would have been leading that work. The Scottish Government Resilience meeting that I was chairing later that day undoubtedly would have touched on that work. And we know from what was happening, had already happened, that work was underway and was progressing. As I said earlier on, the question of whether it was progressing quickly enough is another discussion, but it was undoubtedly progressing.
There's no note of any discussion or information being shared about procuring personal protective equipment, is there?
Again, that does not mean that work wasn't underway. We had, I think, in fact, I think, again, I can't bring it up. Perhaps you can bring it up, but I think one of the first Cabinet meetings, one of the first briefings I received in January 2020 told me about the first release of face masks from the national stockpile. So clearly, again, just because this note doesn't say that these issues were discussed at this particular Cabinet meeting, the evidence, both in documentation but in reality of what was happening, was that this work was underway.
The earliest predictions in January from Professor Woolhouse had involved a prediction of a pandemic fuelled by mild cases with mortality amongst the vulnerable. Scotland was known at this stage to have an elderly and vulnerable population, that there were recognised health inequalities amongst those with protected characteristics and in lower socio-economic groups. Isn't that exactly why a project had been put in place to introduce Public Health Scotland to address those issues?
Could you repeat that question? Sorry.
Yes, certainly. I'm pointing out that the earliest predictions in January 2020 from Professor Woolhouse had involved a prediction of a pandemic fuelled by mild cases with predicted mortality amongst the vulnerable. Scotland had an elderly and vulnerable population with recognised health inequalities amongst those with protected characteristics and in lower socio-economic groups. I've asked you, this was why Public Health Scotland, by this stage, was in the process of being set up to deal with those very problems. Isn't that right?
Yeah, sorry, it was the very final part of the question.
Yes.
I hadn't quite caught. Yet one of many reasons why Public Health Scotland was being set up. Public Health Scotland was due before COVID arrived with us. Public Health Scotland was due to be formally established, I think, on the 1st of April 2020, and that was a long-standing programme of work. I think it's important to say that it is not the case that the Scottish Government only started dealing with these issues when Public Health Scotland was established. The Scottish Government, through many of its pre-existing bodies and processes, were acutely and intensely focused on health inequalities and the needs of older people. Public Health Scotland was established because it was thought that having a body of that nature, particularly one that brought the health service and local government more closely together, would be better able to do that, amongst other things.
There's no discussion here, no mention here of any discussion or any information being provided about any steps to try to protect that vulnerable part of Scotland's population.
I know from the work that was underway in the government at that time that all of these issues were being progressed, all of these issues were being worked on. I suspect that, because I know that because not all of that is encapsulated there doesn't mean that wasn't happening.
Okay, well, what steps were being taken to protect the vulnerable part of Scotland's population?
All of the work we were doing to understand COVID, to make sure we were preparing and scaling up facilities like testing, making sure that we were in a position to supply PPE. And I know there were many concerns raised about all of these things. I'm not suggesting all of that worked perfectly. All of that was designed to protect, as far as it was possible to do in the face of a pandemic, the entire population, and within that those who we were beginning to understand were going to be more vulnerable to a virus of this nature. It was part and parcel of all of the work we were doing.
At this stage, the Scottish Government was asleep at the wheel, wasn't it, Ms Sturgeon?
No.
Could I ask you some questions, please, about the COBRA meeting, which took place on the 12th of March 2020? We went through some evidence in this regard with Mr Gove. It's a meeting which was chaired by Mr Johnson. If we could go to INQ 0000562221, please. Could we go to page 8? Thank you. You may recall, Ms Sturgeon, that there was some discussion around this stage as regards Scotland's emerging position, that it was interested in seeking to cancel mass gatherings, which did subsequently happen. At paragraph 15, it says, continuing, the Chair said that the GCSA should use the announcement to set out what stage 2 should be and begin socialising options 3 and 4 to protect the most vulnerable. The general public would not be asked to do options 2, 3 or 4 immediately, but these policies would come in the next few weeks. He respected the Scottish Government's decision to cancel mass gatherings to manage pressure on emergency responders, noting that as the pandemic progresses, this approach may need to be taken by the whole of the UK to protect public services. However, it was crucial for the Government to stick to the sage advice as far as possible. The 4 nations should try to stick together as one united kingdom. And at page 10, there's a list of actions where it states Chief Medical Officers for all 4 nations, Department for Health and Social Care and Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport to prepare advice for consideration by COBRA on approach to mass gatherings. And then the decision reached underneath at number 5, COBRA will keep under review the policy towards mass gatherings with particular reference to their impact on public and emergency services. We can see from the first page of this document that this meeting, chaired by Mr Johnson, took place at 1:15 p.m. Do you read that, as I do, to the effect that there was an agreement that COBRA would keep the issue of cancelling mass gatherings under review, and that further advice in that regard would be provided by, amongst others, the Chief Medical Officers for all 4 nations?
I accept the reading that you have put on the minute. I was at the meeting, and
yes,
there was no doubt in that meeting that the Scottish Government was going to confirm a decision to advise that that day. It was later, before we had legal powers to enforce it, but that we were going to advise the cancellation of gatherings of over 500 people. You rightly point to the time of that meeting, 1:15. Just before that meeting, I had taken part in the weekly session of First Minister's Questions in the Scottish Parliament, and I advised Parliament that that is what the Scottish Government was minded to do. We would obviously listen to other views at COBRA, but this was a Scottish Government decision to take. I was in no doubt in that meeting that that is the decision the Scottish Government was going to take. By this time, I was increasingly concerned that we were not moving fast enough to deal with the rate of transmission of COVID. I heard it referred to, I think, perhaps by Mr Gove in evidence to you, that I jumped the gun on mass gatherings. I would counter. I think by this point, none of us were jumping the gun. We were arguably all going more slowly than we should have been. I think the public was ahead of governments at this point in the action they thought was appropriate. My view on mass gatherings, which I set out to COBRA, was that for three reasons I thought it important to take this action at this time. Firstly, that while the medical advice was that open-air events were relatively less risky than others, it was not the case that there was no risk of transmission. And I thought at that stage, given the state of the pandemic, we had to do whatever we could to reduce the risk of transmission. Secondly, I was increasingly concerned at that point about the pressure on emergency services, having to police large events when they were dealing with other pressures associated with COVID. And thirdly, I thought there was emerging a serious disjoint in the messaging of governments, that we were seeking to communicate that this was a very serious threat, but yet saying it was okay for them to continue to go and gather together in big crowded events. And if people saw that it was okay to do that, would they be less likely to follow the other advice we were giving them in the day-to-day business of their lives? Before lunch, you asked me about the rugby match at Murrayfield, and I think there is, as you put to me, an argument that should not have gone ahead. So that was my position. I set it out at COBRA, and I indicated that the government would confirm that decision. Jean Freeman went back to the Scottish Parliament that afternoon to announce, to confirm what I had said at First Minister's questions. And I announced a decision that the Scottish Government had taken, and I would assert very strongly then, and I would now, that having taken that decision, we were perfectly within our rights to take that decision, and I was perfectly not just within my rights to announce it. It was important that I announced it, alongside, which we may come on to, the other important decisions that were taken at COBRA that day, that it was essential the public were given quick and effective information about.
Are the minutes wrong then?
If what you're saying, if what the reading of that minute is, forgive me, if your reading of that minute is putting a question to me that says I somehow breached good faith and that I did something that was against the agreement in COBRA, there was no doubt in that COBRA meeting. I mean, I think it's not on the page that's in front of me just now, where it says the Prime Minister respected the Scottish Government's decision, or words to...
I think it was the passage that I referred to earlier at page 8.
Yeah,
yes.
Which, yeah, he respected the Scottish Government's decision. I mean, it's clear that he understood we had taken a decision.
Well, to be fair, Ms Sturgeon, if one reads that passage in isolation without looking at the subsequent actions, one might conclude that. But one obviously needs to see what's reached by the end of the meeting in the actions, which involved further advice being taken on the issue.
All I can say is I was in that meeting. I recall it very clearly. And there was no doubt that that was the decision that I communicated. I tried to persuade the other governments to follow suit. As it happens, they all did, I think, follow suit within 2 or 3 days, because the situation was developing at pace and in a not good direction. I believe the Scottish Government was right to take that decision then. And if I have a regret about that decision, it's not that I took it that day, it's that I didn't take it days earlier.
Including in relation to the Rugby International?
I tried to reflect in my answers earlier. I suppose what I'm trying to reflect here is how difficult those decisions were, and how to describe now, looking back with hindsight, something as, in very binary terms, right and wrong, I think is not always fair. in the nature of the decisions we were taking at the time, but it is one of the decisions that, yes, if I look back on and could take, have my time again, may go the other way. But that match was the weekend before that. So certainly, yes, I think that was, yes, if I have a regret, it is not that I took the decision too early, it's that we took it too late.
You did announce at 3:20 p.m. that day that mass gatherings of more than 500 people will be banned in Scotland, is that right?
If you're telling me that's the time of day, I did it roughly, yes.
Yes. You also provided other updates from the Cobra meeting, such as the decision not immediately to close schools. You made these announcements before Mr Johnson was due to speak to the public about the outcomes from the Cobra meeting later. What were the reasons for the timing of your announcement of these matters?
Well, I'll give you the reasons for the timing very clearly in a second, but perhaps just to be clear, and I don't mean this in a political sense or in any way seeking to be adversarial, my responsibility as First Minister was to the Scottish people, not to Boris Johnson. I tried and he tried, I'm sure we all tried to work as collegiately as possible, but my responsibility was to the Scottish people. Why did I announce those? The very nature of the decisions we were taking, we were in a pandemic of a rapidly transmitting virus. The nature of the decisions we were taking meant that they had to be communicated quickly and clearly to the public. At this particular point, the 12th of March, my strong sense was that the public were anxious for their governments to act, to do more, to be much more on the front foot. We were in that meeting, as well as the discussion about mass gatherings, we had decided at that meeting to advise isolation of symptomatic cases. That was really important in trying to stem transmission. These were not decisions that were meant to be kept secret. It wasn't just important that they were communicated, it was important that they were communicated quickly. So I would put it that it wasn't that I communicated these things too quickly. Perhaps the UK government were communicating them too slowly and perhaps not doing so with the urgency that at that point was required.
Did you tell the UK government of your intention to make the announcement at 3:20 p.m?
It would have been, I'm certain would have been known. I don't know whether I specifically said. Again, I don't mean this to sound in any way politically adversarial. I have a duty to communicate. This was advice we were giving the public. How were the public meant to know what we were asking them to do if I didn't tell them? In Scotland, if I didn't tell them, and the rest of the UK, other leaders didn't tell them. My expectation, and what I do remember, my expectation was that by the time Boris Johnson would already have spoken out of that Cobra meeting. The media, the public, on that day, I remember, were desperate for information. I guess I was surprised that I spoke before him, not because I went too quickly, because I was surprised at the time I did it, he hadn't.
These obligations of which you speak are not mutually exclusive, are they? One can have an obligation to the Scottish people, which of course you had, but you can also have an obligation to try to do what one can to maximise the efficiency of four nations working, which was the policy at that time. So therefore, would it not have been possible to discharge both of those obligations at the same time? Absolutely,
and I always tried to do it. There was only one occasion that I recall in a Cobra meeting where the timing of respective communications was discussed, and that was on Monday the 23rd of March, the day we went into lockdown. And in that Cobra meeting, there was a discussion about the Prime Minister communicating first, and I agreed and honoured the agreement that I would wait until he finished. This was in the evening, I think, before I did so. At no other point was there, who's going to do it first, or you shouldn't do it before I do. I left that Cobra meeting thinking it important to communicate the decisions that had been taken to the Scottish people, because it involved the Scottish people doing things and not doing things in order to we were in a race against a virus, in order to try to stem transmission of a virus. I fully expected the Prime Minister to do exactly the same. I think it would have been wrong and negligent to wait for ages before telling people what that Cobra meeting had decided.
Did you consider that you had a duty of confidentiality as regards the matters discussed at the meeting?
I did not breach confidentiality. I am not bound by confidentiality in a UK government sense, but nothing in this these were Scottish government decisions. The fact that we were all agreeing them in a Four Nations context did not change the fact they were decisions within the power and responsibility of the Scottish Government. I was not breaching confidentiality, and I would go further than that and suggest that given the situation we were dealing with, the whole notion of confidentiality is a bit absurd. This was a virus that was spreading rapidly at this point. We were taking decisions that were about trying to stem the spread of that virus, and the only way those decisions could have the desired effect was if the public knew about them, and if the public knew about them quickly. And therefore, in my view, the responsibility on all of us, I can't speak for Boris Johnson, but the responsibility on all of us was to get out there and tell the people of Scotland, tell people across the UK what we were asking them to do and not to do in order to, if we'd operated on the basis of these decisions being confidential, then I think self-evidently that would have been a very, very mistaken position to be in.
There was a commitment at this stage by the Scottish Government to seek to promote Four Nations working in light of the fact that the virus was no respecter of man-made boundaries or responsibilities. Is that right? I
had a strong commitment to Four Nations working, even when the detail of our approaches started to diverge. I didn't ever form a view that Four Nations working wasn't important. My understanding of Four Nations working is we aligned our approaches where we could and where we were, for legitimate reasons, taking different approaches. We tried to nevertheless work together, understand each other's position and coordinate where we could. But I had a duty as First Minister of Scotland to the people of Scotland. If I had simply, in order to keep a notion of Four Nations working that I know some people hold to, which is that it should mean we all do this exactly the same at all times and that should be decided by the UK government, I would have ended up, and the Scottish Government would have ended up, acquiescing in decisions that we thought were wrong and not in the interests of keeping people as safe as possible. But I had many, and I know Michael Gove spoke about this on earlier Monday, I think he was here, and we worked. I would pay tribute to Michael Gove in particular on these matters. We had didn't always agree, but we had very constructive discussions. I always sought to work as collaboratively as possible within the Four Nations framework, but I couldn't allow that to usurp my duty as leader of a government with particular responsibilities to take the decisions we thought were best in the circumstances. It
would be necessary in order to try and promote the likely success of Four Nations working to work with respect for the other participants in that process. Do you think that's a correct principle?
I do.
You said a moment ago that you considered the UK government's expectation that these discussions would be conducted confidentially to be absurd. Does that suggest any respect on your side?
I don't think it suggests a disrespect. I was making a point about the nature and status of decisions being taken in the face of a spreading virus, and making the point that by the very nature these can't be confidential decisions because otherwise the public doesn't know about them and therefore can't implement them. And that's the point I was making. I always try to be respectful in all my dealings with the UK government. There were, not just in COVID, but in many things, moments and issues of tension where no doubt they found me difficult to work with. At times I would find them difficult to work with, but I always tried to be respectful and be constructive in those interactions.
Mr Gove gave evidence to the fact that what had happened on that day caused considerable irritation, at least on the part of a number of individuals, including the Prime Minister, on the basis that there was a perception that you had not behaved respectfully and breached confidentiality. Was that a phenomenon of which you were aware at that time?
It wasn't particularly. I suppose I can see why that would have been the case. At that point, the last thing in my mind was I wasn't setting out to irritate anybody, but equally I wasn't, I had reached a view, the Scottish Government had reached a view that to try to stem transmission of the virus, we should advise the cancellation of mass gatherings. COBRA had taken a decision that was asking people with symptoms of COVID to isolate and not leave their homes. I took the view that it was vital to communicate these decisions and to communicate them quickly and effectively. I wasn't doing it to irritate anybody, and I'm sorry if that was the effect, but my overriding, I got lots of things wrong in the whole process of this. I don't suggest otherwise for a second, but my overriding motivation and priority was to try to reach the best decisions, communicate those decisions so that the public could comply with those decisions and we could collectively try to stem the spread of a virus that was already doing significant harm.
The phenomenon of you making announcements about matters before the UK government would go on to become something of an issue between the governments. Were you aware of that?
Yes, I was. I didn't think then, and I don't think now, it was fair or rational. Fairly early on, I can't remember exactly when, my daily briefings became set at a time of day, I think 12:15, slightly later in the day, when I gave statements to Parliament, because that was determined by parliamentary sitting times. So my public announcements were at a fixed point in the day. The UK government decided to have theirs, and I'm not making any criticism, but they decided to have theirs at 5 p.m. or thereabouts. That was their choice. If they had wanted to speak before me every day, they had the choice of doing that earlier. I was simply trying to communicate decisions to the public that we were relying on the public to comply with. I was trying to do that openly. I was trying to do that as clearly and as effectively as I could. At no point in my thinking was I trying to steal a march on anybody else or trying to get ahead of it. I was simply trying to do my job to the best of my ability.
Your job, however, as we've identified, involved a responsibility to the Scottish people, of course, but also a responsibility to try to promote four nations working. Why was it that those two obligations were not able to coexist?
I don't believe it is the case that they didn't coexist, but in order for me, I have to choose my words carefully here, in order for me not to use the phrase that's been put to me, irritate Boris Johnson, I think I would just have had to adopt a position of doing whatever Boris Johnson wanted me to do. Now, as First Minister, if I thought we will focus here on areas of disagreement or divergence. There was a huge amount of good joint working and alignment and the different governments working together effectively. But where I thought the UK government was taking a decision for England that was not the right one, I would have been negligent in my responsibilities just to go along with that in order to avoid bizarrely irritating people. I suppose another point in this is it's been described, it's often described as if the UK government's position on these things was the orthodox one, and any of the devolved administrations that diverged were stepping out of that orthodox position. That's not, I think, the right way of looking. Often in these issues where the Scottish Government was in the language the UK Government would use, diverging from their four nations preferred road, we were joined in that by Wales and Northern Ireland. So often Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland were in exactly the same position, but the UK Government, as was their right, had decided to take a different position. In effect, they often became the outlier in four nations decision-making, not Scotland.
Surely that can't have been the UK Government's position, Ms Sturgeon, because in the schedules to the Coronavirus Act 2020, the UK Parliament had granted power to Scotland, we'll avoid the word to diverge, to differ, to take a different path. I'm
not sure I understand the question you're putting to me.
You were suggesting a moment ago that the UK government thought that the way this should work is that their position should be the orthodox one, and there should be some limitation on Scotland's ability to take a different path. The legislation made it clear that the UK Parliament had granted that power.
No, indeed.
So that cannot possibly be the UK government's position.
What I'm saying is often that some of the comments you're putting to me about me being, or others being irritated at things I did.
Those aren't my words.
No,
Forgive
forgive me, Mr. I know they're not your words. But that gave the impression that while the legislation was exactly as you set out, when the reality of that manifested itself in different decisions, then somehow that was an irritation. It was not intended to be an irritation. We were all trying to do our best based on the epidemiology, on the demographic and health profile of our countries, to try to take the best decisions we could. I simply make the observation, the first, I suppose, significant policy divergence was in early May over the stay-at-home advice when the UK government decided to move to stay alert. It's often been suggested that that was the point at which the Scottish Government diverged from Four Nations decisions. In actual fact, at that point, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland stuck with stay at home, and the UK Government for England moved to stay alert. I'm just making the point that when things are described as the Scottish Government moved outside of Four Nations decision making, we took the decisions we thought were best, but often we were in the same position as two of the other four governments that made up the Four Nations.
On the subject of the legislation, was it your understanding, or had you received advice about whether the Scottish Government considered that the Scottish Parliament had power to impose restrictions before the enactment of the Coronavirus Act 2020, which came into force on the 26th of March?
I know, I was aware, and we were always very clear that until that act came into force on the 26th of March, 25th, 26th of March, as you say, that you take mass gatherings, until that point, it was advice that we were giving. It was not enforceable until that point. And similarly, I think with the initial stay-at-home advice for a period of a day or two, that was advice until the legislation came into force.
So the position, as you understood it before the enactment of the Act, was that the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament did not have the power to impose restrictions, hence those decisions were issued on an advisory basis?
Yeah, we wouldn't have had the power to enforce restrictions. We, of course, had the power to advise people to do certain things.
Which is what you did over that period. Did the Scottish Government push for an earlier lockdown?
Well, the Scottish Government started, so no is the answer to, the simple answer to that, in the sense that we weren't pushing. The advice to have a lockdown really only crystallised through COBRA on the 23rd of March, so no. But as I think we have just been reflecting on in the context of mass gatherings, the Scottish Government was starting to move, or argue that we should be moving more quickly. One example of that is the one we've been talking about, mass gatherings. We also took the decision to recommend the closure of schools slightly, I think, as it happened. Others followed suit again fairly quickly. But at that point, I was of the view we had to start moving more quickly, and started to demonstrate that through the examples I've spoken about. Before I say this, I can't say, and I don't know that anybody can say with certainty, what difference it would have made in the overall trajectory of the pandemic and the outcomes of the pandemic. But of the many regrets I have, probably chief of those is that we didn't lock down a week, 2 weeks earlier than we did.
You are a staunch supporter of Scottish independence.
I believe that the record will show that to be true, yes.
Yes. It runs through you to your very core, does it not?
It does.
Is it possible, do you think, for you to take decisions on any matter without seeing them through the prism of Scottish independence and your burning desire to achieve it?
Yes, I know for a fact it is, and if I ever doubted that before COVID, although I had other examples of doing that in the job of being First Minister and Health Secretary before that. I have been in politics for 30 years. I've been a lifelong campaigner for independence. I don't think in my entire life have I ever thought less about politics generally and independence in particular than I did during the course of the pandemic, and particularly in those early stages of the pandemic. People will judge, for better or worse, the decisions my government took. I want to say to people and give this inquiry an assurance that none of those decisions were influenced in any way by political considerations or by trying to gain an advantage for the cause of independence. I was motivated solely by trying to do the best we could to keep people as safe as possible. And we did that to some extent, but not to, and perhaps we never could have done it to the extent I would have wished we could have done. And I carry the regret for the loss of life, the loss of opportunity, the loss of education of our young people. I carry the regret of that with me every single day. But in all of the mistakes I made, that I will concede, some I may argue weren't mistakes, I will absolutely assert very strongly that I did not take decisions for political reasons, and I certainly did not take decisions influenced in some way by considerations around the constitutional argument. On the 18th of March 2020, my Constitution Secretary, Mike Russell at the time, wrote to Michael Gove saying that we were suspending all work on an independence referendum. That didn't recommence, apart from reactive work and a particular very focused thing before the Scottish election in 2021. That didn't recommence until much later in 2021. The government I led focused entirely on trying to do the best we could through COVID.
It's a matter of instinct for you, isn't it, to seek to promote the cause of Scottish independence?
Yes, it is, but perhaps when you suddenly find yourself in a position of being the leader of a government in the face of a global pandemic, you suddenly find that the instincts you thought you had are not the instincts that come to the fore. My only instinct in the early part of 2020, and this remained the case, was to try to take the best decisions I could, and for my government to take the best decisions we could to steer the country through COVID. And I hope that people observing the Scottish Government, observing how I went about things during that period, whatever they think about me, my politics, my government, I hope that any reasonable person will have seen that.
It's a matter of instinct to seek division between the Scottish Government and the UK Government to achieve and promote the cause of Scottish independence, isn't it?
No, it's not.
As you said, the position, as at the beginning of the pandemic, I think you said the 18th of March, was that Mr Russell had written, in fact, to Mr Gove to indicate that campaigning for a second independence referendum would be suspended.
Yes, I think we also requested at that time that the UK Government did likewise around the constitutional project of Brexit, and that was declined. The UK Government never suspended any of its work on Brexit. One of the reactive things that the Scottish Government officials had to do during COVID was respond to consultation on the Internal Market Act, for example.
It was the transition period for Brexit, wasn't it, in 2020?
There were...
So work was required on that?
Well, I think that is perhaps a matter of opinion rather than fact.
Okay. Could we look, please, at INQ 000214408? Page 13, paragraph 56E. This is the 30th of June Cabinet minutes. An agreement is reached at the end of this Cabinet meeting that it was agreed that consideration should be given to restarting work on independence and a referendum, with the arguments reflecting the experience of the coronavirus crisis and developments on EU exit. The Cabinet agreed on that date, did they not, to seek to promote the cause of Scottish independence by politicising the pandemic?
No, I respectfully don't think that is a a fair or accurate reading of that part. I remember the meeting. There was no particular discussion. This was a Brexit paper. Again, we were having to consider issues around Brexit. We had no choice in that matter. This was a Brexit paper. There was no particular discussion around that recommendation, as far as I recall. We agreed that consideration should be given to restarting work. In matter of fact, work did not restart. It was not consideration that led to that happening. And that is the fact of the matter. We agreed to consider something. I certainly am not aware of being part of any real consideration, because in my mind there was no prospect of starting work on independence at that time. But in any event, it didn't happen.
Why would there have been any mention of this at all, given Mr Russell's announcement?
I think it would have been very difficult in the context of a debate or a paper on Brexit, perhaps for that not to have, so that would have arisen in the context. This was not a COVID paper that this conclusion was attached to. This was a paper on EU exit. It was a paper on Brexit.
The words say what they say, Ms Sturgeon. Consideration should be given to restarting work on independence in a referendum, with the arguments reflecting the experience of the coronavirus crisis. I appreciate the words say what they say. I'm not arguing with that, but the facts also say what they say, which was that whatever consideration may or may not have been given, I certainly wasn't part of it at that point. And if somebody had come to me after that and said, right, OK, should we consider this and restart work, I'd have said absolutely not. The facts are that no work did restart on independence at that point. You've told me earlier in other contexts that cabinet minutes are really the highest source of authority as to what was actually happening. Not in this case, apparently. Well, I'm not saying they don't reflect an outcome of cabinet. I'm saying that didn't happen. So we didn't restart work. Whether or not cabinet had, somebody in the course of a cabinet meeting had said we should agree consideration of this, the fact is it didn't happen. A few hours after this meeting, on the same date as these cabinet minutes, you appeared on your regular coronavirus briefing and said, frankly, anybody who is trotting out political or constitutional arguments is in the wrong place completely and has found themselves completely lost. Is there not a hypocrisy between saying publicly that anyone who is making constitutional arguments during the pandemic is in the wrong place and completely lost, and there having been a decision in Cabinet hours before that there should be consideration of restarting work on the campaign for independence, reflecting the experience of the coronavirus crisis? That had not been a significant part of the discussion. It was clearly a comment that was made, otherwise it wouldn't appear in the conclusions like that. But I did not leave that cabinet thinking we were about to restart work on independence, and I would have made my views clear that that was not going to happen if that had been the case. We didn't restart work on independence. We didn't, we had to, over the course of the pandemic, we had to respond to a court case that had been taken about a judicial review that had been taken. Governments have to answer PQs or FOIs. We had to respond to some Brexit, but we didn't. All of the team that had been working pre-COVID on independence and an independence referendum had, at the start of COVID, been redeployed into COVID work.
Sturgeon, that's not a comment. The minutes read agreed. That means Cabinet agreed, doesn't it? Well, so are you saying you would have overruled Cabinet?
If after that, so let me be clear what I mean. There was clearly some comment made in that Cabinet meeting that said, oh, maybe we should think about restarting work on independence. Remember, this was at a point where we were going into the summer 2020, where cases were falling, and
no, just please focus on the point. It's agreed. It's not a comment. It's an agreement by Cabinet.
But agreed that consideration should be given. What I meant is, if somebody had come to me afterwards and said, we've done this process of consideration and we now think we should restart work on independence, I would have said, I don't want to do that. And I would have said to Cabinet, let's not do that because it's not the right time to do that. But I think more materially, that didn't happen. Nobody came to me and said, if that said, agreed to restart work on independence, that would mean something much more than that does. There was not a process of consideration that then saw somebody come to me with a proposal to restart work on independence. And I'm sorry, my lady, I'm genuinely sorry if it sounds as if I'm dancing on the head of a pin here. I don't mean to. But the key point here is that we did not restart work on independence at that point or anywhere near that point.
If it were to be decided on the basis of the evidence before this inquiry that there was a politicisation of the pandemic and that you had used the pandemic as a means of pursuing your goal of Scottish independence, that would be a considerable betrayal of the Scottish people, would it not?
With respect, I don't believe that conclusion would fairly be reached because it's not what I did, and I don't believe there is evidence to suggest...
But you've given your position, Ms Sturgeon, as to whether you did it or not. My question was, if it were to be decided that that's not right,
if I had
that would be a considerable betrayal of the Scottish people, would it not?
If I had at any point decided to politicise a global pandemic that was robbing people of their lives and livelihoods and educational opportunities, and had decided in the face of that to prioritise